Good morning, everyone. It is with a great pleasure that we welcome Professor Franco Nasi today as plenary speaker at the 8th Annual European School of Literary Translation Summer School. The topic of the school this year is Training the Teacher of Literary Translation, Creativity and the Human Factor. And it focuses on the value of translating as a human experience, on the creativity of literary translator, in what sense a literary translator can be considered an original author, and how creativity can be cultivated in the classroom. Franco Nasi is a former professor of American literature and theory of translation at the University of Modern Age and Media. He has taught as visiting professor at the Loyola University in Chicago, University of Chicago, University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, the Beijing Languages and Culture University, and is now a professor of American and comparative literature at the Fondazione Unicamp San Pellegrino in Rimini. His research interests include comparative literature, theory and history of translation, aesthetics, history of criticism and poetics. He has published and edited several books on translation studies, among which Poetic in Transito in 2004, La malinconia del traduttore in 2008, Specchi comunicanti in 2010, Traduzioni estreme in 2015, and with Angela Albanese in 2015 also, Artefice aggiunto, and Tradurre l'errore in 2021. He is the translator of English and American authors, including Coleridge, Wordsworth, Whitman, and contemporary poets such as Billy Collins and Roger McGough. The title of his presentation is Maths on Cats, Freedom, Constraints, and Creativity in Literary Translation. Please, Franco, can you?
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you for your presentation. And let me thank Roberta and Duncan for this kind invitation and all the people that are connected with us from, I know, everywhere in the world. To stay within the limit of time that I had, I decided to write a few notes and I will read them and with the help of a few slides. But before we get to that, I'd like to begin with a very brief personal statement and a brief personal note and a more general statement. Now, throughout my career as a teacher, I have had the privilege of working with many different students in various schools and settings. I started out as a high school teacher, and then I moved eventually to the university where I taught for more than 30 years, both in the United States and in Italy. Over the year, I've covered a range of different subjects, as Stefano just said, like Italian literature, Italian language, comparative literature, Anglo-American literature, and theory of translation. But one constant in my teaching has been the use of literary translation. And for me, it's not just exploring the languages or analyzing the styles of the authors we study in class, although that is certainly a very important aspect of our teaching. But more than that, I found literary translation to be a highly effective and engaging way to challenge my students' critical and creative thinking. As I.A. Richards once said, translation is one of the most complex intellectual activity humans can undertake. I completely agree with that, and I think we all agree with that. And today, more than ever, we as educators have the responsibility not only to teach technical skills, but to help our students to think critically, independently, and with a flexible and creative way. One of the ways I enjoy pushing my students' boundaries is through the translation of what I call extreme texts. These are texts that come with strict formal constraints, the kind that people often consider untranslatable. I'm talking about nonsense literature, wordplay, puns, anagrams, lipograms, nursery rhymes, etc. I've heard that many of you, of the people enrolled in this summer school of literary translation, have been working with children's books, and these are really mine of this kind of text. So it's the kind of text that truly test the limits of language and interpretation. So what I do today is simply sharing a few of these texts with you. Most of them have led to fascinating translation experiences and some reflection on the nature of language. And this is what Antoine Berman used to call traductology, so the theory of translation or reflection on translation. So let me share with you now the slides. And here. Okay. So this is the title, Freedom, Constraint, and Creativity in Literary Translation, Mats on Cats. And you see a silly image of a mat on a cat. A little more than 100 years ago, exactly in 1923, a book titled Chance, Love, and Logic by the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce was published in New York. Peirce is well known as mathematician, philosopher, and the father of the American pragmatism, and most importantly for us, the founder of semiotics, so the study of science. Chance, Love, and Logic is a collection of essays that have previously published in previously published in scientific journals, including two very important essays, The Fixation of Belief and How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Now, I'm not going to dive into this book, although it's a fascinating and challenging book. Instead, I'd like to draw your attention to the three words in its title, chance, love, and logic. I've chosen to adopt these three words as guiding principles, or if you want to, polar stars, for our conversation about literary translation today. I'll use logic to represent rules, constraints, and vertical thinking involved in translation. Chance will stand for the creativity and lateral thinking that translation demands. And love, well, that represents pedagogy, the passion, and the resonance that translation can inspire. Now, let me briefly introduce these three keywords now, and I'll return to each one of them later on for a more in-depth discussion. As we all know, when it comes to translating a text, one must first have a fixed belief, as Charles Sanders Peirce said. One must believe that it is possible, useful, and sometimes even necessary to transform a text from one language to another, from one culture to another, and from one time period to another. We must also have a clear idea that there will never be such a thing as a perfect translation. Aiming for perfection in translation is obviously, as we all know, an impossible ideal. However, even though every translation is an approximation, that doesn't mean we can approach it casually. Translating a text requires a deep understanding of the structure of both the languages and cultures involved. We must be familiar with the linguistic rules, cultural habits, and socio-economic, stylistic, and historical contexts of both the source and the target language, or I would say the target culture. In short, this expertise, the knowledge that informs most of our translation decisions, bring to us to our first guiding principle, and that is logic. Anyone with experience in translation knows that sometimes it's relatively easy to transform a sentence, an idiomatic expression, or even a single word into another language. But at other times, it seems almost impossible. The dialogue between two languages is never fully predictable, notwithstanding all the computer things that we know. Let me share a very simple example. This comes from Roger McGough, a wonderfully creative English poet who recently had his collected poems spanning from 1959 to 2024 published by Penguin. The example is a brief and playful poem that shows just how funny and lucky translation can be. It goes like this. This is the cover of the book I was mentioning. Poem against capital punishment. I live in the capital and it is punishment. Okay. In Italian, we have the expression pena capitale for capital punishment and capitale for city capital. So in this case, even a computer program or a junior high school student could easily translate the poem, thanks to the lucky and casual coincidence. But this ease of translation doesn't always carry over the other languages. You may think about your own languages, and maybe could be a tough, challenging poem to translate if you don't have capital punishment as in English or in Italian. And this is exactly what happens when we have to translate the following children's poems by the same author. Here. To amuse emus on warm summer nights, kiwis do wee-wees from spectacular heights. In Italian, there is simply no way to retain the puns or paronomasia between amuse and emus, or between kiwis and wee-wees, if we stick strictly to the logic of the dictionary. However, this is where lateral thinkings come to play. Sometimes the unforeseen or unplanned, or even the unintentional can be incredibly helpful. We have to remember the languages and their relationships with each other are not rigid or completely codified. They allow space for freedom and creativity. Chance, of course, together with rules and constraints, is an inherent part of language itself. This brings us to our second guiding principle, which I mentioned, chance. Now let's move to the third guiding principle, or polar star, love. If we don't at least respect or better admire the text we're working on, our translation risks coming out sterile and lifeless, like the kind of language we use when we speak to someone without truly engaging. In those moments, when what we are saying isn't a vivid act of communication, but rather a collection of cut and paste cliché. There is a wonderful passage in an essay by Douglas Hofstadter, written as an introduction to his translation of François Sagan's La Chamade. In this essay, Hofstadter explains how he approached translating the novel. His goal was to form a deep, almost physical connection to the text. Years earlier, when he worked on translating Pushkin's Onegin, he memorized many of the stanzas in Russian before even beginning the translation. For La Chamade, instead of memorizing, he took a different approach. He transcribed the text by hand into his notebooks, leaving 2 blank lines before each line. He described this process as a way of making the original work my own. Afterward, he would write his translation in a different color ink, directly below the original text. This is what he wrote in his essay. If anyone had asked me during my translation period why I was spending so much time on this activity, I would have replied, it's very simple, out of love. Just a few passages earlier, Hofstadter wrote that he realized how he tends to seek to marry beautiful books that have a powerful emotional effect on me. When translating a text, we need to be logical, to follow a number of steps respectful of the rules of the game. It is necessary that each one of the text features is taken into account with the utmost care. The rhythmic elements, the rhetorical and phonetic figures, the intertextual allusions, the norms of poetic institutions, all these and many more features form and give life to the literary text. Focusing only on one aspect or characteristic of the text, such as, for instance, the lexical meaning, is useful, necessary, as long as we are aware that it is only a step toward a more solid textual translation as a whole. To use a simile, we should always keep in mind that we consider the text as a chain that is a succession. We should always keep in mind that if we consider the text as a chain, that is a succession of constraints mechanically and not organically connected, then the text we reconstruct in a different language and in a different culture will be as weak as the weakest link of the chain. I once more took this simile from the already mentioned book by Charles Sanders Peirce. It deals better there with philosophy, but I think that the image fits well our field of interest. This is what Peirce writes. Philosophy, I intend here translation, ought to imitate the successful sciences in its method. Its reasoning should not form a chain which is no stronger than its weakest link, but a cable whose fibers may be even so slender, provided they are sufficiently numerous and intimately connected. So translations should operate in the same way, not by privileging a single constraint, be the lexical meaning, the sound composition, or a metaphorical formulation, but by compacting the many elements so as to form a sturdy rope with many new intimately connected threads. Sometimes, or for a certain kind of text, the respect of every rule is not enough. Now, let me move to an experience of translation where both logic and chance were called into action. It is a literary extreme text, or a nonsense nursery rhyme, if you prefer, written by Gianni Rodari, a famous Italian poet. Now, the text is in Italian, but don't worry if you don't understand the language. We'll move step by step into it. But first of all, let's read the text aloud. And let's consider this reading as a first translation of the written text. So reading aloud is, as we all know, important, very important in a lot of many literary texts, even prose, not only poems. So Rodari's poem goes like that in Italian. Filastrocca corta e gaia, l'abbaino non abbaia, la botte più grossa non è un bottone, la mela più grossa non è un melone, e il mulo più piccino non sarà mai un mulino. What doesn't have to be a foreign language scholar to hear that there is an overall cadence music, a rhythm of the lines, and that there are, and here I highlighted them, alliterations and phonetic recurrences due to rhyming, like abbaino, gaia, or abbaia, or paronomasia or word plays like abbaino, abbaia, botte, bottone, mela, melone, mulo, mulino. The phonetic texture of our nursery rhyme recalls the amuse on War Summer Nights, Kiwis the Wee, from Spectacular Eye, by Roger McGough that I mentioned before. Now, a second version of our interlingual will be an interlingual one, and is concerned only with the semantic meaning of the different words and the syntactical structure. For this, I simply use a DeepL translation. You have the Italian text, and this is a DeepL translation. Nursery rhyme, short and gay. The dormer doesn't bark. The biggest barrel is not a button. The biggest apple is not a melon. And the mule, smallest, will never be a mill. I haven't changed anything from the translation that I found on DeepL. We are reading here a stricto sensu nonsense, whereas Rodari's text, playful and surprising as it may be, follows a coherent compositional logic. At this point, one can take two different roads, leading to dissimilar territories. One would be phonetic, and the other semantic. One can decide to stick to the verb bark, abbaiare in Italian, and look for a word with a similar root, like barkentine, which is a ship, not a sailing ship. So we could have a barkentine doesn't bark, which is more or less the meaning of l'abbaino, the dormer, or gable doesn't bark. Or one can find a different semantic relation between words. In English, we have the word dogwood, which is a tree. And since it is a tree, it does not bark, even if it has, as we know, the bark. So we can go on with this kind of wordplay and have a second translation, There could be sound like this: nursery rhyme, short and gay. The dogwood doesn't bark. The biggest bottom doesn't bottom up. The biggest apple will never show a melon up, and the shortest donkey will never be a dawn. So it makes sense. It's a nonsense. It makes sense. I make children laugh too. But the translation, I think, is not moving, has no cadence, has no rhythm. Now, a new logic steps in. We can insert rhyme and erase useless syllable in order to get to a speakable, let's say, singing kind of nursery rhyme. And this goes like, nursery rhyme, short and lark. The dogwood doesn't bark. The biggest bottom doesn't bottom up. The biggest apple won't show a melon up. And the shortest donkey will never be a dawn nor a key. Now, this translation is certainly interesting, I think. But there is one important aspect of the original nursery rhyme that we haven't yet considered: the consistent logic that runs through the entire Italian version, which is the relationship between large and small. In the original Italian rhyme, we have botte and bottone, barrel and big barrel, mela and melone, which is apple and something like a big apple, and mulo and mulino, so a donkey or a mule and a small donkey. Now, what makes this even more complicated is that in Italian, words like bottone, melone, and mulino, so you see the three words there, have a double meaning. So bottone is also button. Melone refers to melon, so honeydew, and mulino is also a mill. So the challenge then is how to preserve the logic in English, a language that lacks the same kind of suffixes that Italian used to convey size differences, so mela, melone. Now, while searching for a final rhyme, and it's guided by our second polar star, what we call chance, I stumble upon an interesting charade. Curiously, the word donkey contains within itself don and key. So you see that there. In a similar way, the relationship between mela and melone, botte, bottone, and mule and mulino, in the original rhyme can be seen as a partial charade, words within words. So we could lean into this serendipitous discovery and this playful coincidence that the need to find a rhyming word for donkey has presented us with. For instance, the word nut hides within the larger fruit, coconut, and nut is not as large as a coconut. So we could play this same logic to the first line of the rhyme as well. And we move to another translation. So nursery rhyme, short and lark, the barkeeper doesn't bark. The biggest apple is no pineapple, the biggest pot is no deep pot, and the shortest donkey will never be a dawn nor a key. So paradoxically, so I don't know if you like this last translation. What I try to do is to show the different steps that I took to try to face all the different constraints that the poem was offering. So paradoxically, through the process of translating even this minimal children's poem, we seem to have followed the path that Goethe described as typical of major literary translations. According to him, there are three key stages. The first is a word-by-word translation that does not aspire to be a literary work on its own, and in our case, to be represented by the DeepL translation. The second stage is a translation that respects the literary conventions of the target language, attempting to be poetic in its own right, though often resulting in something closer to an adaptation or even a parody. And that could be the rhyming translation that I did, the third one that I showed you. Now, the last and final stage for Goethe is a sophisticated interlinear translation, perhaps what we have achieved maybe with our latest attempt. As Berman, drawing from Steiner, wisely observed, this is a quotation from Berman, literalism is not the easiest or the first method of translation, but the last. In this sense, a literal translation is not just a mechanical word-for-word rendering. Rather, it is one that engages with the true literality of the text, the complex web of rhetorical figures, rhythms, semantics, phonetic word praise, and everything else that makes the original what it is. It was purely by chance that the English word donkey, which we use to translate mulo, could be split into two distinct terms. And it was by chance that this coincidence offered a linguistic solution for the botte, bottone, mela, melone, and so forth pairs, a structure that forms the backbone of Rodari's poem. What I want to highlight here is that while rational, logical thinking is essential in translation, we must also be open to finding alternative paths when we encounter seemingly unsurmountable linguistic walls. We have to be ready to take advantage of the unpredictable opportunities that language, with all its flexibility and freedom, can provide. Okay, now, in my translation classes, I often challenge my students with the nine dots puzzle. If you have seen it before, the solution might come easily, but if it is new to you, I suspect that many of you may find it a bit tricky to solve. So let's give it a try, and let me state the problem here. The task is to connect 9 squarely arranged points with a pen by 4 or fewer straight lines without lifting the pen. Okay, so while I'm drinking a glass of water, I'll leave you try this little 9 dots puzzle. So you can just draw 4 straight lines without lifting the pen, trying to touch all the 9 dots. I leave you a minute or so to think about it. Okay. Well, I'm sorry you are not in a classroom. We could, talk and see if some of you was able to manage this weird problem. Let me go to the solution of it. But let me say this first. It is impossible to solve the problem if one thinks that the 4 straight lines have to be traced inside the imaginary perimeter of the square delimited by the dots. The problem did not mention that specific constraint, but very often, and with no reason, we assume that. The solution is less difficult if we overcome this self-imposed unconscious limit and draw lines outside the imaginary box. So I don't know if the arrow works here, but if we start from this dot and we go in an oblique way to the other part of the square and then go down, come out from this imaginary square and draw the line outside again in a diagonal direction, and we close the 4 straight lines. So in this way, we touch all the different lines. Now, the 9 dots puzzle is often used to hire people by testing the extent to which an aspiring manager can think unconventionally from a different perspective. In psychological terms, one would say using lateral thinking, or with a metaphor, thinking outside the box or beyond the box. An example of lateral thinking at work is the way we use the casual coincidence of the pregnant word, I like to call it so, donkey pregnant, to solve the small big grammatical relationship in Rodari's poem. The chance
moment open up a space for invention. And by invention, I mean it in the original sense of the word, the Latin word invenire, which means to find rather than to create something from nothing. Now, this leads us to another key term in our discussion. It's at the core of your workshop, and it's still connected to chance, and that is creativity. Now, I don't believe that creativity is a trait that you either possess or lack. I believe it can be cultivated and taught. And I see translation as one of the most powerful and stimulating ways to foster creativity and enhance critical thinking. A translation is never just a straightforward reduplication of the original. It is an exercise that is both rigorous and creative. Many renowned linguists and translation theorists, people like Leo Spitzer, Mona Baker, or Gerhard Steiner, have pointed out the deep creativity involved in the act of translation and the use of language. Steiner captures this tension well in the following quotation. The craft of the translator is deeply ambivalent. It is exercised in a radical tension between impulses to facsimile and impulses to appropriate recreation. In a very specific way, the translator re-experiences the evolution of language itself, the ambivalence of the relationship between language and world, between languages and worlds. In every translation, the creative, possibly fictive nature of these relations is tested. So creativity in translation is the ability to find solutions that respect the rules of the game. Solutions that are mindful of the linguistic and cultural constraints involved in the process. These solutions are possible precisely because of the free space that exists between languages and within their constraints. Now, in mechanics, the necessary free space between gears to prevent them from ceasing is called clearance. In Italian, this concept is captured more poetically, let's say, by the word gioco, which means both play and game. This gioco is the vital space of freedom within the limits of language. Now, finding this tiny space of freedom and playfulness is what ensures that a translation is dynamic, vibrant, and full of life. By the way, and by curious coincidence, the tool used to shape gear teeth in Italian is called creatore, which translates into English as maker or shaper or literally creator. When gear teeth are perfectly sized, there is not enough room for movement, no clearance, no backlash, no gioco. And this is what happens very often with the computer assistant translation or the machine translation. To create the appropriate clearance, you actually have to reduce the thickness of the teeth by pushing the hub, or creatore, deeper than the theoretical standard, restoring that vital tolerance for movement. Similarly, linguistic creativity and translation style find their legitimacy in the freedom that every linguistic system inherently possesses, as these systems are dynamic and dialogic by nature, and yet defined by their inner and historical constraints. Now, a valuable resource for fostering the open-mindedness necessary to think creatively or outside the box is Gianni Rodari's The Grammar of Fantasy, an introduction to the art of inventing stories. Now, I skipped this part because time is running, but as you see here, there are many translations of this book in many different languages. So what I tried to do in the paragraph that I'm skipping now is take the second chapter of Rodari's Grammar of Fantasy, which aim is to introduce people to invent stories. So it's creative and doesn't have anything to do with the translation directly. But I try to use the second chapter of this book as a text that could be translated in different languages. So what I was suggesting is you could take, suppose that you translate from Dutch into English, you might get the Dutch translation and ask your student to work it to translate into English. And the kind of problems that you find there would be very challenging, both to practice their critical thinking and their creative thinking in your own language, but also in the translation. So I skip these examples, but they are very funny. And I move to another delightful book that I highly recommend as a tool for enhancing lateral thinking and creativity. And I go back to Roger McGough, the poet that I mentioned before. And it's an illustrated books. These are examples that I want to show you, but I skip it. And so Roger McGough published a book that is called Imaginary Menagerie. The book came out in 1988 and has the illustration too. Is made of 72 poems, very funny, similar to Amusinus that we read. Now, I like to read them simply and to ask you to simply identify the different constraints that could be problematic in a classroom work, and maybe invite you to get this book and work with it with your students. So I simply read them because they are very funny, I think, and very challenging too. So word fish. Word fish are swordfish in a state of undress, crisscrossing the ocean in search of a nest. Shark. Ever see a shark picnic in the park? If he offer you a bun, run. Anaconda. Ever see an anaconda drive through town in a brand new Honda? Don't ask him for a ride. You might end up inside. Anteater, where have you been? And list talkie-walkies and hasn't been seen, nor has Aunt Mary, Aunt Lil, or Aunt Di. Anteater, why the gleam in your eye? And here another one, dormouse. The dormouse, I misspell it, 2 O's, of course. The dormouse is seldom seen except perhaps at Halloween. The practical joker of his genius to grown-ups is a proper menace. The silly game he likes to play is banging on doors, then running away. So the dormouse becomes a dormouse. So there we have the switch in the animal. Now, when translating these poems, we encounter several challenging problems. Phonetic homonyms, like anteater versus anteaters, words embedded with words, such as anaconda or sword word fish, and crucial rhymes like shark in the park. There are always also neologisms with puns, such as dormouse and dormouse, adding another layer of complexity. On top of these playful elements, we face more traditional constraints like rhyme, metrical cadence, and other intertextual features. Now, the first edition of An Imaginary Menagerie was illustrated by Tony Blundell. In translated edition of picture books, the original illustrations, as you know, are usually retained, which creates yet another challenge for the translator. These images act as what I call paratextual constraints, meaning the translation must also align with the visual context presented by the artwork. Now, here is an example of a funny poem. It's a concrete poem, and you have to read it from the bottom to the top. Beware the elevator if you see one in a shop, it will let you ride upon his back, then eat you at the top. Here we have the rhythm, we have everything, but we also encounter a neologism, elevator, which presents its own challenge. The poem is structured as a concrete poem where the graphic arrangement of line is essential. On the top of the usual metrical and rhyming constraint, there is also an added paratextual element, that is the illustration. Now, the visual element forces me to stick to a specific type of imaginary animal. For example, I came up with a very gratifying kind of translation, which was squala mobile. So I thought to translate elevator with squala mobile, which is a creative pun that combines scala, which is escalator, scala mobile, which is escalator in Italian, and squalo, which is shark. So squala mobile would be female shark elevator, escalator. However, I could not have used this translation if the book were to be published in Italian with the same original illustration. So I had indeed, but what happened was that I had the opportunity the pleasure of translating and publishing Bestiario Immaginario in Italian a few years after. Now, let me tell you something about this. This is a cover of the Italian translation book that was published by Gallucci. It was an immensely rewarding experience, of course, not financially, as translating poetry, especially children's poetry, is often what we call the Cinderella of literary translation, which is the Cinderella of translation in general, but for the sheer joy of working on it. The published agreed to include both the English and the Italian texts, which is unusual. Along with the introduction, I wrote that aimed to introduce 10-year-old readers to translation studies. At the end of the book, we also added a glossary where I attempted to explain what happened in the source text. I'm especially proud of the subtitle Traduzioni aperte, open translations. And by open translation, I meant two things. First, that the translations were fluid and open-ended. And second, that the young readers were invited to try their hands at creating their own versions of the poems, perhaps with some guidance from the glossary, which highlighted the key challenges in each. The true highlight of the project came when Roger McGough, who had illustrated the second English edition of the book, kindly offered to create new imaginary animals if I needed to alter the type of creature in my translations. This allowed me the freedom to include squala mobile as a creative solution for translating elevator. It also ensured me I had the right image for translating the British idiom bookworms. And here you have it, which in Italian is topi da biblioteca. So I completely changed the animal, but I kept the rhyming and the images in it. And Roger McGough was nice enough to do a new drawing of this. Now, this experience was absolutely joyful. I had the rare opportunity to work with intellectually stimulating texts, an open-minded publisher, and take all the time I needed to shape the translation. And having Roger McGough actively engaged in the project only made the process more special. That my two children even tested the translation and offered their own suggestions. It was an experience filled with happiness and relaxed, playful, yet challenging dialogue with a foreign text. Now it's time to turn to the third polar star, which is love. And I hope that using words like love, admiration, and respect for the literary text doesn't portray me as a new age follower or a sentimental, old-fashioned romantic. Earlier, I mentioned the passage where Hofstadter describes the physical connection he established with the text he was translating, memorizing one of them and rewriting the other by hand. He metaphorically referred to this process as, if you remember, marriage with the text. When we talk, we use metaphors, thanks God, even if academic writing tends to avoid them. The point here is that if we don't nurture a strong and empathetic connection with the text we are translating, our work can easily turn into an imposing monologue. By this, I mean that translation risks becoming a one-sided imposition on the translator's voice, ideas, and style, rather than the true dialogue, a fruitful exchange between texts, languages, ideologies, and cultures. When love is absent, the translation may end up feeling cold, mechanical, and impersonal, like a product rolling off an assembly line, instead of a handcrafted result of a careful, thoughtful artisan. In such cases, the only voice you might hear is the translation. In the translation is that of the translator, who imposes his or her own worldview or style. or even worse, the voice would be that of a lifeless, standardized language, devoid of character, nuances, and individuality. Now, time is really running faster than I thought, and so I'll try briefly to summarize and indicate a reading that you can do, of course, and by yourself, and that is this short story by Raymond Carver, Cathedral, where we have a wonderful example of a relationship between two characters that is dialogical and based on friendship. Now, this theme of friendship is also in one analyzed and deeply studied by Stefano Arduini in this book that I know is coming out in English very soon, called Gli occhi dell'altro. And I leave this reading to you while I tell you briefly the story that happens in the cathedral. In Carver's story, there are three main characters: a couple, husband and wife, and Robert, a wife's friend and former co-worker. Robert has been blind since birth. 10 years after the wife and Robert last worked together, the blind man pays a visit to the woman and meets her husband for the first time. The husband is detached and embarrassed. He doesn't know how to talk to Robert and how to deal with a blind person, to the point that he tends to avoid interaction. The two get to know each other a little at a time. After dinner, they drink whiskey in front of the television. There is a program about the cathedral in Lisbon. The husband asks Robert if he has any idea of what cathedrals are. Robert replies that he only knows a few things about them and asks his guest to describe what is shown in the TV program. Through the voice of his interlocutor, Robert is thus able to imagine the cathedral. But words are not sufficiently precise, so Robert, this is an unexpected turning in Carver's story, asks the man to take a sheet of heavy paper and a pen and draw the cathedral together with him. So this is what happens. And he found my hand. This is the husband that is talking. He found my hand, the hand with the pen. He closed his hands over my hand. Go ahead, Bob, draw, he said. They go on in this way until the cathedral is outlined on the paper. At this point, Robert asked the husband to close his eyes and continue drawing, but now with the blind man guiding the movement. And so we have this new change. The blind man is leading the drawing. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. Now, this is where the story ends and the friendship is born. So it's an adjustment toward the other that is not annexation, as Arduini was saying, but a relationship, in this case also tactile, a relationship that leads to the creation of something new. The husband who saw the cathedral on television translates it into paper for Robert. Then Robert, in turn, leads the husband into a world where things are seen and told, not through the eyes, but by a movement of the hand, of the body. This friendship allows the husband to leave his home while remaining at home, to leave his own border and meet the other in a third space. Now, we all know that translating is inherently an act of domestication. While this is inevitable, translators should strive to balance domestication with the genuine experience of the otherness of the source text, trying to leave home while remaining at home. The metaphor beautifully captures the delicate tension in translation, embracing the unfamiliar without entirely losing one's grounding. Now, unfortunately, literary institutions, publishing policies, and rigid aesthetic principles statistically equivalences often impose restrictions that act like blinders, narrowing the translator's scope and limiting creative choice. These constraints may reduce the rich experience of engaging with a foreign text to a mechanical task driven by a deadline and market demands. A deep relationship with the text cannot be rushed. We need time. Translating requires time, not only to read the text, but also to study the context, to try different translation strategies, to carefully revise the translation. Of stutter methods of handwriting the original text my semantic weight in our digital age, but it exemplifies a form of deep engagement that allows the translator to internalize and reflect on the work more thoroughly. Handwriting is a slower, more contemplative act than simply copying and pasting, much like how taking thoughtful, organized notes on a physical text offer a different form of intellectual possession than downloading it digitally. The latter often leads to a superficial engagement, a sense that we have the text, but not in the way that allows us to truly own it. Now, this is what happens, and we know that in our classrooms, students cut and paste from download from internet, whatever, they write their short essay and they think they have it. They don't have anything. You need to go through a process of reworking what you read. Now, of course, to do this, we need time, and we don't have time now, since time is running. And at this point of my talk, I wanted to call your attention to a sociologist. His name is Hartmut Rosa. I know he's quite popular in Germany, and of course in England too. Most of his books have been translated, and so this is a kind of reading that I really would suggest you should do. And always work begins with a musing, a reflection on the notion of time and the use of time that we do now, the concept of time we have. And it's very funny because he says something that we all know. We never have time. And this is incredible. It's sort of paradoxical if you think that we have internet. We can do many things that we used to do in person as today through internet. So let me use this example that I'm doing now. If all of you would have to work your way to find your way, drive to or take a train or a plane to come to Rimini just to meet me and listen to what I'm saying now, well, it would have taken a lot of time. How many hours did we spend queuing at the bank to get our checkbook, not books of checks? We don't use checks anymore. How much time did we spend queuing at the post office trying to pay a bill? Now, none of us does that anymore, and yet we never have time. So Rosa's reflection on that is that this is something that is peculiar to our late modern societies, time and alienation. We always have to run, we always have to go somewhere, but then at the end, we never have time to do anything. So this is what he writes here. He says, our late modern society are regulated, coordinated, and dominated by a strict temporal regime, which is not articulated in ethical terms. Hence, modern subjects can be described as minimally restricted by ethical rules and sanctions, and therefore are free, while they are tightly regulated, dominated, and suppressed by a larger, invisible, depoliticized, undiscussed, untheorized, and unarticulated time regime. This time regime can in fact be analyzed under a single unified concept, the logic of social acceleration. Now, I could get lost in this kind of things. The point is that Rosa deals with this idea of time in modern society, and from this he moves to a concept that is alienation. So we tend to see things alienated from us. Even a text that we read can be alienated for us. It's simply something we have to work on, but never get in touch with it deeply, not own it. And he opposes this idea of alienation to the idea, and this is something that we use in translation studies, but that he works from a sociological point of view, that is the idea, the notion of resonance. And he says here, let me just simply read a few passages of this they highlighted here. I can read completely the screen, so I need to find it in my notes. Yeah, so what is resonance? It's the capacity to be affected by something and in turn to develop intrinsic interest in the part of the word which affects us. Is a core element of any positive way of relating to words. Now, I might give you the slides, and so you can read at ease this quotation. The point is that Rose goes on in his studies and gets to a very interesting application of his sociological approach to late modern society with this resonance pédagogique, which has been translated into Italian, and I know that there are part of it online available at within the Journal of British Institute for Learning and Teaching. And this is a very nice conversation that he has with Wolfgang Endres on pedagogy. And I think this could be a nice suggestion for us and for teaching creativity and how to establish a kind of resonant relationship with the students. Entering into a new relationship with the word means adaptively transforming it. Try this at school and enjoy the goosebumps when teaching and learning work for everyone involved. So this idea of the goosebumps it's funny, but I think each one of us has experienced that either in a positive way or in a negative way. Sometimes we go into a class, we talk to kids or to students or whatever, and we see that there is no reaction. We are seen as something else. We are far away from it. There is no resonance relationship. Some other time, luckily, something begins, something starts unexpectedly. And what they do is, what is established is a kind of resonance relationship. It's difficult, Rosa says, we can try to construct everything, but the resonance doesn't happen. We can set our classroom in the best way possible, find a nice environment, but then nothing happens. Sometimes this happens, sometimes doesn't. Of course, what we have to do is try anyway to make the situation comfortable, relaxed. Talk to the students, don't just teach them the creativity. We have to create with them. And I close my talk here, 5 more minutes, I think, with another experience that I happened to do. And this is something that I did a few years ago in Modena, where I taught theory of translation, and I was involved in a workshop on translation. And the first part of the workshop was led by a colleague who dealt with translating from Italian into English using corpus 8. Topics varied from current news to tourism to public service leaflets. So this was more logic and traditional way of translating, able to use CAT tools and other computer devices, aiming at the acquisition of a standardized and correct English language. I was in charge of the second part of the workshop that dealt with the translation from English into Italian of what I call extreme texts, and most of them were children's books. We began with the text like swordfish or fish or a museum used by Roger McGough, trying to identify what we call the intertextual constraints, so puns, metric, rhythm, rhymes, and so forth, and comparing the numerous solution of the students. The same was done with picture or illustrated books, so the paratextual constraints, and also with intertextual constraints with parodies and allusions. Now, the most rewarding experience, however, was the collaborative translation of a couple of popular picture books recently published in English and not yet translated into Italian. The books are Oi Frog and Oi Dog, written by Cass Gray and illustrated by Jim Field. It's a dialogue between animals. Now, the first one is a dialogue between a frog and a cat, and it is described on the cover of this colorful book as a hilarious rhyming tale about a frog who discovers that all animals have their special place to sit. What happened is quite simple. The cat tells the frog to sit on the log. The frog doesn't like the idea and asks to sit on the mat. Of course, cats sit on mats, says the cat. The frog tries something else. What about a chair? And the cat answers back that hares sit on chairs. And from then on, there is a surprising list of places where the different animals must sit, simply because their names and the names of the objects are phonetically corrected and rhyming. Thus, mules sit on stools, parrots on carrots, foxes on boxes, gorillas on pillars, rats on hats. The frog at the end of the book seems to be convinced that there must be a rule, but has a last question for the cat. What do dogs sit on? Says the frog. And the cat, I was hoping you weren't going to ask that. Is the cat answered? And the last image closes the circle with the dog sitting on the frog that was supposed to sit on the log. Now, the second book of the series, Oi Dog, you see the cover here, is the revenge of the poor frog. Frog begins by changing the rules. It's not frogs, but rather dogs that must sit on logs. And this is only the start of a number of surprising new combinations of places and animals. This is a brief description of the written text, which could be easily translated without the impassable constraint of Field's beautiful illustration. And here are a few images that I showed you. So you see seals on wheels, an ape, apes sit on grapes, or a whale sit on nails, or a lion sit on irons, or a parrot sit on carrots. And now, a few months before the beginning of my workshop, the publisher, Carlo Gallucci, the same one of the imaginary Menagerie by Roger McGough, asked me first whether these books were translatable, and secondly, if I was willing to try. Since I tend to think that everything is translatable, I was tempted to accept the job. But the more I thought about it, the more hopeless I felt. I simply could not find the right key to unlock the text. All my solitary walks, cups of tea, and bicycle rides waiting for some lateral thinking to happen were useless. So I said to the publisher that I was going to give it to my class as a collaborative assignment and see if something would come out of it. The text was given to the students at the end of our semester workshop after they already had the opportunity to face many other challenging translations. They were informed, this is important, and aware that the assignment was a real project with a real publisher interested in the translation and a teacher who was unable to do it. The class was quite large, about 70 students. They worked on the first book in class for a number of hours in small groups of 3, exchanging first impressions and setting the problem together. Then each group finished its translation and made a tome and sent it to me. When I began to read their solution in class, I was astonished by their creativity under these constraints. Using the images and well aware of the logic and stylistic structure of the composition, they were able to solve all the different challenging rhymes and images in a smooth, highly readable and funny translation. We discussed the different solutions in class, decided which were the most convincing, and tried to polish the text by working on details of the number of syllables, the alliteration, and other details. A few examples. In Italian, parrots is pappagalli, and I go back to the image here. Here, pappagalli, and carrot is carote. So no way pappagalli can sit on carote and rhyme. The illustration of the picture book has two parrots, one big and the other small, sitting on a heap of carrots. So the solution, il pappagallo e suo nipote siedono sulle carote. So a parrot and his nephew sit on carrots. Of course, in English it doesn't rhyme, but in Italian it rhymes perfectly. So this is some kind of lateral thinking. I cannot solve the problem with the language. I can solve it with the image. Find a way. The small parrot is not the son or the daughter of the parrot, but it's the nephew because it rhymes with carrots in Italian, nipote carrot. A huge ape, and this is the one we saw before, sitting on grapes. The translation of one of my students was lo scimpanzé sull'uva chardonnay. And I think you can understand it. So chimpanzee is like in English on the Chardonnay grape. And this one was very funny. It's like a Hindu fakir on a bed of nails. And we have La balena di Collodi sta sui chiodi. So Collodi is the writer, the author of Pinocchio. So everybody knows the whale or the shark of Collodi. And they made this unexpected rhyme. So I may not have been, icing on the cake. The publisher, the English writer, accepted the translation, which were published and signed as a collaborative translation of the class. So I may not have been the goal-scoring star of the match, but at the end, I felt like a satisfied and proud coach, not able to run as fast as his players, nor to kick the ball hard enough, but perhaps useful in setting up the game, in defining the problem, and giving the player the opportunity to display their talent and ingenuity in solving it. 3 more minutes to conclude. We know that cats usually sit on cats. But why is this? Well, mats are fairly comfortable and cats seem to like them. Plus, the word cats and mats pair nicely together in English, creating the stereotypical image. Of course, cats can sit on couches, rugs, or even sneak under sofa. Yet, it is language that leads us to this familiar, almost inevitable image of cats on mats. But what if we flip the script? While it might be odd to picture a cat under a mat, language allows us to image just that, as it allows us to see a flat on a mat or a mat on a flat. Language allows us to imagine that mat and cat are not what we are usually thinking they are. This brings us to the world of translation. I use the two words in the title of an academic paper that goes like that. Mat on cats, mat tools as antidote to digital dishumanities and a key to survive in standardized world. In our field, the word cat immediately connects to cat tools, where CAT stands for computer-assisted translation. In a broader sense, CAT might serve as an advocate for machine translation, or MT. While they are not the same, they might say they are like relatives, okay? A little more than kin, but sometimes less than kind, as Hamlet would put it. Now, what about MAT? I'm afraid you won't find this in any glossary or database because it is an acronym that I invented. MAT stands for Mind Assistant Translation. By mind, I mean both the logical, vertical kind of thinking and the more creative lateral type of thought. It is not just about the mind, though. It is about the heart, the hands, and why not, the spleen, the vocal cords, and all the parts of ourselves that come into play where we engage deeply with the text. In literary translation, mat should always stand over cat. In other words, while machine can assist, it is the human mind, rich, creative, critical, and intuitive, that should guide the process. Life, after all, is more complex than the cliche of cats sitting on mats. Yet, statistically, it is true that somewhere, sometimes, you might find a mat sitting on a cat, or even bats sitting on mats. And while doing that, the bats might wear funny hats, chat with wombats, and pretend to be acrobats, democrats, or even diplomats, not to mention what rats might do. Here is one doing his daily workout on a yoga mat. And now, translate that, and thank you. Okay. I don't know if there are any questions, or if there is someone still connected. I don't see anything. Okay. Well, I think you can you all see the so the first question, would you use artificial intelligence to help? Okay, I'll read the questions here. Would you use artificial intelligence to help you translate puns in poetry? If so, how? Well, I never did. Well, I try to show you, well, I know that DeepL is sort of an artificial, I don't know if you intend that the DeepL is an artificial intelligence AI to help you translate puns in poetry. So far, I found it so challenging and so funny to do it by myself that, of course, cat tools like, you know, the database and the dictionaries and so forth are very useful. But every time I try to solve a pun or something like that with DeepL, I haven't tried with ChatGPT or something, but I wasn't able to find any good answer to that. So at the end of my talk, I try to explain the little pun between mat and cat. So I think we should be there with our body and our mind and try to solve that kind of problems. Duncan, thank you so much, Franco, for you demonstrate very powerfully how extreme text invite extreme translation methods. In your view, can this extreme method be used legitimately, productively, instructively to tackle the extreme text too? Well, as so I don't have a method with a capital M. I think you need to, the experience that I did with my student with the collaborative translation on Oi Dog, Oi Frog, and so forth was really surprising, because really I had no idea that they could come up with such wonderful solutions. And there was no fight among the students. I mean, they were really collaborative. They applauded when someone found the right answer. I didn't grade their creativity. When you introduced our the students of the school, summer school of literary translation, someone asked, how can I grade? Now, this is the kind of obsession that I think Rosa, the sociologist, help us to identify it well. So our obsession to measure everything. My method in a classroom is to make everybody comfortable, first of all, and to try to establish with them a real relationship. Of course, most of the time I fail. I know that perfectly, but that's my idea. it's the idea that we are working on something that does not have an answer, a unique answer. And this is something that is typical of translation. When I have to solve a mathematical problem, sometimes, at least in the books that I had when I went to school, there was the answer. I had to get to that number at the end of the problem. In translation, we don't, because languages allow that what I call joke, the freedom between the gears. So that freedom, the joke is within each language, and even more between two foreign languages. So we should find that space that is the creativity. So creativity is not something that you do whatever you want to, but within the constraints we have, we should find that tiny little space to be really ourselves. So the method is that, I think. So to make students aware of that and to make them think, to make them work critically. Someone before said that the more shy students were able to find solution to problems, to translating problems, particularly with their creativity. And this is what happens very often. So just let them be there in the classroom without the obsession that you have to reach something, without the obsession of time. Time is also another terrible constraint. I know that when we work, we have to be paid, we have to translate a certain number of pages, otherwise we will get to the end of the month and pay our bills. I know that. But in a classroom, I think we should, first of all, transmit this respect for the text, for the other text, and the respect for the author, and the respect for ourselves, who are translators, I think. So let me see. Well, there are no other questions. I don't see them. So Christy, thanks, and Ibrahim, thanks as well. So I don't know if it is up to me to, oh no, maybe there are more. Maybe I should go down. I'm sorry. Okay. So Letizia, molto interessante. Thank you for the Italian. Gonzalo, thank you. Okay. Congratulations to the students. This is absolutely correct. So, yes, so this has the imaginary Menagerie be translated into Italian? Yes, the title is Bestiario Immaginario. I don't have the book here with me, but well, I remember, for instance, the swordfish, wordfish. The poem in English goes, swordfish are wordfish are swordfish in a state of undress, crisscrossing the ocean in search of a nest, which is a wonderful concentration of alliteration and with all these s's. And so what I tried to do with that was to find the name of a fish that could work without one or two letters. So I thought about scorfani, and when like scorfani sono orfani, un po' sotto stress. I can't remember it now. See, somebody handed to me the. Well, for instance, anaconda, the other one that I translated, that I show you. Ever seen an anaconda drive through town with a brand new Honda? That was similar to the poem with the capital punishment. I live in the capital and its punishment. So it was easy because in Italian, anaconda translates anaconda. And we also have the motorcycle Honda. So the translation was, hai mai visto un'anaconda sfrecciar per la città su una fiammante Honda? Non chiedergli di salire o in pancia vai a finire. So I had to keep the rhymes and the rhythm of the text, but it was very easy. The other one of the the shark. Ever seen a shark picnic in the park? If he offers you a bun, run. In Italian comes out to be, hai mai visto uno squalo far picnic all'idroscalo? Se ti offre un po' di pappa, scappa. So this is for children, of course, so I tried very easy rhymes and see if I can find it. Word fish. So word fish, as I say, I tried a fish, the name of a fish that could work also without the first letter or letters. So in Italian, we have scorfano, which is a fish. If you take off the first two letters, you have orphans. So it's like they lost their parents. So in Italian, word fish are sore fish in a state of undress, crisscrossing the ocean in search of a nest, comes out to be pesci orfani. Orfani sono scorfani un po' sotto stress, vanno in cerca per il mare di una C e una S. So here again, the constraints of the... Okay, so the title of the book is this one, Bestiario Immaginario. Okay, so thank you to many people here. So you said you had a great students' effort. Have I understood that correctly? If that's true, have you taught translation for the student? You did great, and how did you approach that? Well, let's say I'm very loose with grading papers, and what we worked together, I of course took notes of what they did, how active they were during our classes. So most of the time, they really were part of the workshop. What I did not do when I began my teaching with them is going to class and saying, now look what I did, buy this book. No, and this is the solution. I said, I have this problem. I don't know how to solve it. Let's try to work it together. They worked on it. And then maybe at the end, I came up with my translation. And sometimes it wasn't as good as the one they did. So this is just to, again, establish a kind of relationship that is not, I am the godfather and you are, the students down there. But I'm sort of the coach. I try to make you play in the best way you can. So at the end, what I did, I gave them in the specific classroom with Oi Dog, Oi Frog, and so forth, I gave them one of the books that we did not translate of the series. So there is another one which is very complicated and has another constraint because all the animals are in alphabetical order. So it was really a mess. I gave them that and I say, you have 1 week at home to work on it and then turn in the final translation, as if I were the publisher and you did your job. So I'm sure that some of them try to ask help to other translator or other friends, or they use the computer. I tried to make them responsible for that. And I had back all the translation of the book and I graded them. I tried to identify all the constraints that they were able to cover and the one they did not weren't able to cover. But I'm very loose in that. That's probably maybe a limit of my teaching, but I don't like the idea that you have to evaluate everything. Translation is very difficult to be evaluated, particularly literary translation. It has to work. It has to work. Okay. Oh, this is Nariman, you said. Thank you for the, could you elaborate on Rosa's resonance and its relationship to the creative process? Is there something intrinsic to the workshop setting that maybe enhances such resonance? Well, yeah, again, I think you should really try to find some material on his pedagogy. It can be very useful. I skipped that part, it was very long and I didn't have time. There is one thing that he says about resonance. Resonance is not an echo, first of all, and that is also another nice image that I think we should think about. Benjamin, in his Task of the Translator, talks about translation as an echo. He said, no, the translation is not an echo, but a resonance. So we have to add something to the original text. It's not just a replication, maybe weaker of the original, but it's a new product. In one of these writings on pedagogy, he says, well, you can, you like a person, he talks about this relationship with the person, he says, you want to conquer her or him. So you organize a dinner in a nice restaurant next to the seaside, the sun, the setting sun, a nice glass of white wine, flowers on the table, nice dress, nice present, but nothing happens. Nothing happens. There is no resonance. So you did everything that you could possibly think of, but that sparks doesn't light up. Nothing happens. So he said, what we can do as teachers is try to work our way in that direction. And I think this is very important, make the classroom a nice place where you're staying. The fact that you are sitting on the desk and the students are down there, this is not the best way to encounter them. What Duncan did today, in the beginning of your meeting, that is the second part of the introduction, the presentation of the people, all the people had to say for 2 minutes who they were. Well, this is something that is sort of welcoming, something that creates a group. You know? So this is very important. We should do that every time we go into a class. Sometimes we do it, sometimes we don't. At the university level, when you have 100 students, maybe you don't do that. But try as much as possible to create a situation where everything is relaxed. So that's why at the end I said Matt as mind-assisted translation. Mind is not only my brain, mind is my body. We are in translation has to do with that, the reading aloud, and so forth. So as for Rosa, I just suggest that you maybe get the 2 or 3 books that I mentioned and reflect on the importance of time and alienation that sometimes we have with the books that we translate. Will the recording be made available later to participants? I think only to the ones that are in the School of European School of Literary Translation. Okay, thank you. Rosaria Fiore says that she used some of my books with the students. Okay, I give you part of my copyright. One last question by Anda. Do students sit in your classroom with their laptops, tablets, or with their pen and papers? When we did the translation of the last book that I mentioned, they had their own computers. Yes, we were in a laboratory, in a language laboratory. So each one had his position and they could use the dictionaries online. And I don't think none of them went into DeepL, honestly. Because when they began to do that, we already talked about the need to be there with their own mind and their thoughts. I think we ran out of time. I don't know, something, if I have to close the, I imagine I have to say goodbye at this point. Maybe somebody's coming in, maybe Stefano.
Thank you, Franco, for your very inspiring presentation, as ever. So we can close the session today and go to the break, to the lunch break now. Thank you again.
Thank you to all of you for your patience. Goodbye.